Good morning. My name is Robert Salas. I'm joined by Robert Jameson and Dave Schindelay, and by remote Robert Jacobs, speaking to us remotely from his home. We're all proudly served in the U.S. Air Force, and we are all witnesses to what's called now the unidentified aerial phenomenon. And we're witnesses to that phenomenon with respect to nuclear weapons. And also with us today is going to be testimonies recorded from past witnesses some of them who may have been are no longer living, and others who are still with us. Our purpose here is just simply to present information about our experiences. We're not trying to prove anything. We're not trying to prove that, well, whatever we want. You might think it's simply relaying the information that we have, the truth as we know it, and those facts as we know them. So we'll just refer to these objects as UFOs. We've given a handout. I don't think the handouts are here, but we will give handouts of signed affidavits of other witnesses and biographies. And I'll begin with a very brief history. Going back to 1945. So we'll begin with the testimony of Lieutenant J.G. Bud Clem, U.S. Navy, while he was stationed at Naval Air Station Pasco, Washington. And this is with thanks to Robert Hastings. And so I'll just play this, which we just got recently.
Got my wings down in Corpus Christi, Texas in 1944, May the 15th. We were called to the flight line to investigate an object that was flying over or moving around over this Hanford Ordnance Works. The object had been detected on a radar down in the neck of the Columbia River, just west of the Naval Air Station there at Pasco. When we got down there, they told us that this bogey was out there right over the Hanford Ordnance Works and directed Lieutenant Commander Brown to take off and challenge him. Ensign C.T. Neal from South Carolina and I stayed on the ground. C.T. went down and got in another F-6F to back up Brown if he needed it, and I went up to the control tower to relay the information from the radar office to Brown. And we talked back and forth. We got Brown up there behind this object, and we asked him what he saw. He said, all I can see is a bright red or reddish orange fireball right up in front of me. There's no form, no substance to it whatsoever, just a bright light. At the time he started in after it, the radar man estimated the speed was probably around 60 to 70 knots, okay, translated into miles per hour, that's probably 65 to 75, 76 miles an hour. But when Brown got behind it, it started moving away, and he kept getting closer and firing up that F-6F faster and faster and faster. But anyway, when he did that, the object, whatever it was, just took off and went boom, boom. He's clear out of sight, no noise. In the car, he wouldn't have heard it in the F-6F if there was any noise. But that just went off and left him, and he circled up there for, I would say probably half hour, maybe 3/4 of an hour, And nothing ever happened again, but it had headed off into the northwest towards Seattle.
So can you tell me a little bit more about what the object looked like?
Well, all that object was a fireball. And Commander Brown said that he couldn't figure out what it was. He said it was so bright he couldn't hardly stand it when he was getting closer to it. But he said he soon got out of range where it was nothing more than just a ball of light. There was no form or no noise to it that he could detect. But the worst part of all of this is that my logbook never showed our experience, and I don't know yet why, but the Navy ignored that, or at least did not tell anybody about that, and didn't put anything in my logbook so I could refer back to it and know what night it was that we flew. But anyway, it was something else.
Okay, that was Lieutenant J.G. Bud Clem telling his story about early 1945. In mid-1945, there was another incident at the Hanford site called the Hanford Ordnance Site. And by the way, this site was used to produce plutonium for the first atomic bombs. And this incident of Lieutenant Commander Roland Powell, a highly decorated World War II pilot, was sent out to intercept a UFO that was, again, detected on radar. He chased what he described as having a saucer-like appearance, bright, extremely fast, with a sort of vapor enveloping it. It climbed to an altitude of 65,000 feet and then just hovered. His aircraft, F-6F fighter, had a ceiling of 42,000 feet, so he couldn't do much about it. Again, I'll note that this incident occurred in mid-July of 1945, and the first atomic bomb test was July 16th, 1945. And that test used plutonium as its fissile material. I'll move on to 1947, very famous Roswell crash. Actually, there were one near Corona, New Mexico, the other on the plains of San Augustine, about 150 miles to the west of Corona. Roswell Army Airfield was the home of the 509th Bomber Wing, and that was the bombers that dropped bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of World War II. And it, at this time, was the only operational atomic base in the country. Initially, the first crash was announced by what you see here. Colonel William Blanchard authorized his public information officer, Lieutenant Walter Hout, to go ahead and get release this as a press release, and it found itself into the Roswell Daily Record. Saucer recovered, and even though there were many witnesses now who have stated that non-human entities were recovered from these crashes, the Air Force has since repeatedly denied these were extraterrestrial craft. And their explanation about what occurred has changed over the years. The Roswell incidents have been verified by hundreds of witnesses, and we have the testimony of one here now. This is Dr. Jesse Marcel Jr., a retired colonel. He's deceased now, but he served as both a medical officer and a helicopter pilot during the Iraqi War, and I'll just play his testimony. And this was given during a 2013 citizens hearing on disclosure, which Mr. Stephen Bassett, I think he's here, organized, and certainly deserves a lot of credit for that.
My story for the Roswell part began in the wee hours in the morning of July 1947, when I was awakened by my dad, who was returning from an assignment to collect debris of unknown origin from a ranch out of Roswell. This is the Foster Ranch, and this is the debris that Mac Brazel had run across. Apparently, the rancher, by the name of Mac Brazel, notified the local sheriff of Chaves County of the downing of some sort of aircraft on his land. He was not quite sure what the nature of this was, He'd seen weather balloons, go down there before, so he was not sure it was that either, but it was something very different. The sheriff in Chavez County contacted Colonel Blanchard, who was the commander of the Air Force Base in Roswell. Now, Colonel Blanchard knew my dad was the intelligence officer, so he dispatched my dad and a CIC agent, Sheridan Cavett, to investigate what this was, whether it was one of our planes or just whatever, it's an unknown crash site. So it was their job to go ahead and ascertain what was out there and bring representative portions of this back to the base so they could study it to make a final determination of this. As it turns out, our house happened to be on the way to the base, and this is in the wee hours of the morning. So my dad, knowing that he had seen something very special, wanted my mother and myself to look at this also, because as he said, you'll never see this again. So what he did, he stopped off at the house, awakened my mother and myself, and again, the wee hours of the morning. It's summertime. I've been playing all day with my bicycles and things like that. I was 11 years old at the time, however. And he brought us into the kitchen, and I saw a smattering of this strange debris on the kitchen floor that he had pre-positioned. He said, look at this. I think this is what you call a flying saucer or remains thereof. I was not quite sure what a flying saucer was at that time because I was more interested in bicycling and using my .22 rifle for practice. But at any rate, the first thing he wanted us to do, or me particularly, was to check the debris out, make sure there was no electronic components there, looking for vacuum tubes, resistors, condensers, and things like that. But there wasn't any. And he already knew that, but he wanted me to satisfy my own curiosity as is. The debris itself consisted of three components, three types. There was a foil, a very tough metallic foil of some nature that I can't really describe. I have to add that I did not see the bending and unbending of it, but my dad witnessed it. He said it would, if you fold it over, it would unfold and assume its original form. In addition, there was black plastic debris, like a broken phonograph record. But the strangest thing I saw was, as being passed around right now, was that this is a replica of one of the I-beams, or the beams I saw in the wreckage. In that, you'll note there's some symbols written along the inside surface of this, and they're a purplish violet hue, semi-reflective of light. But this is basically what this was.
Was this a replica?
Yes, sir, this is a replica. If it was original, I wouldn't have it.
Well, you never know. That's why we're asking.
That's right. So, but anyway, my dad drove the debris into the base that night. I think it was that night or maybe early next morning, where he was assigned by Colonel Blanchard to fly the material to General Ramey's office in Fort Worth. This was flown in the belly of a B-29 under armed guard. So my dad, I saw a picture of my dad taken in General Ramey's office, holding what was obviously a radar target. They had already switched the debris. And the look on his face is quite telling. He says, you gotta be kidding me. This is not what I saw. And this is not what I saw either. But at any rate, that's where the cover began, in General Ramey's office. So when my dad got home, he sat my mother and myself down and said in no uncertain terms, you will never talk about this. This is a non-event. And yes, sir, I was an Army brat, so I was following orders. So I never discussed this with my friends or anybody else until after Stan Friedman interviewed my dad in 1978.
In 1994, Congressman Stephen Schiff asked GAO, Government Accounting Office, for information about Roswell. The GAO wrote him back about a year later, actually, and stated outgoing messages related to Roswell were destroyed without authority. However, there was one teletype from one FBI office to another that the GAO did include in their report. And I'll just read from parts of that teletype. It says, 8th Air Force telephonically advised this office that an object purporting to be a flying disc was recovered near Roswell, New Mexico, resembles a high-altitude weather balloon, but that conversation between their office and Wright Field had not borne this out, this belief. Disc and balloon being transported to Wright Field by special plane for examination. So Wright Field became the home of Air Technical Intelligence Service, we called ATIC, and they're the ones that essentially received the results of the debris field. So, my next slide here. On September the 23rd of 1947, the chief of the Technical Intelligence Division at Wright Field, essentially ATIC, General Nathan Twining, sent a letter to the commanding general of Air Force Intelligence stating that after a preliminary study of UFO reports, the phenomenon is real and not visionary or fictitious. Now, the question I have is, how could they have come to that conclusion within a couple of months of the Roswell incident unless they had received the debris and analyzed it? So, and then I'll jump to, let's see, current day. This is from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, preliminary assessment of the unidentified aerial phenomenon, June 25th, 2021. And the executive summary says, most of the UAP reported probably do represent physical objects. This is a pretty startling admission by the Department of Defense. I certainly have never seen anything like this before, but essentially they're agreeing with that previous letter from September of 1947. This is real, not visionary, it's not swamp gas. And so where do we go from here? I'll jump now to 1948 to 1950. This is a letter from Air Force Headquarters to Director of Air Force Office of Special Investigations, summary of observation of aerial phenomena in New Mexico. And I'll just read a couple of paragraphs. It says, it was determined that the frequency of unexplained aerial phenomenon in the New Mexico area was such that an organized plan of reporting these observations should be undertaken. The next statement, the observers of these phenomena include scientists, special agents of the Office of Special Investigations, USAF, airline pilots, Los Alamos security inspectors, military personnel, and many other persons whose reliability is not questioned. The phenomenon have continuously occurred in the New Mexico skies during the past 18 months, and these phenomena are occurring in the vicinity of sensitive military and government installations. So that was a letter written in the late 40s, early 50s. In fact, the U.S. Air Force did have a reporting regulation in 1959. This is AFR 200-2. It's 7 pages of regulation on UFO reporting requirements and responsibilities by Air Force personnel. It defines what is meant by UFO, and it defines what the Air Force interest is in UFOs as a possible threat to determine technology or scientific data and anything to explain the phenomenon. So that was the purpose of these reporting requirements, so that more Air Force personnel would report and the proper way to do that. This regulation was eventually withdrawn, but it did exist in 1959. Now we'll jump to early 1960s, and this is the testimony of of Jerome Nelson, former Air Force First Lieutenant. While he was an Atlas missile crew commander at Walker Air Force Base, which is formerly Roswell, in 1964. On 6 different occasions, maintenance crews reported UFOs overhead, and again, directing a beam of light on the missiles. So Lieutenant Jameson is still living, by the way. And so he was anxious to, again, repeat this story for you. And now we're going to go by remote connection, I hope, to Dr. Robert Jacobs. A professor emeritus of communication at Bradley University. He retired after teaching at several universities over the span of 40 years. In 1964, he was the officer in charge of a photo-optical instrumentation group squadron at Vandenberg Air Force Base, California. One of his duties was to provide photographic documentation of missile test launches. So I think we'll turn it over to you, Robert. Robert, you can hear me?
I can hear you just fine, Bob, and welcome to the Ozark Mountains where I live right now. Can you hear me back there? Just give me a nod. Can you hear me, Bob? I'm out here in the Ozark Mountains trying to talk to you.
Dr. Jacobs, go ahead and we'll go through your slides.
Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and start talking. I hope y'all can hear me. Yeah, we live down here in the Ozark Mountains in southwest Missouri, and it's a little difficult to get these transmissions in and out of here. But I want to start out by first saying that we owe a large debt of gratitude to my friend Robert Hastings, who wrote a book called UFOs and Nukes. If you use folks in the press, I highly recommend that you get it, because it is conclusive proof that what we're talking about today is real and has happened and has been happening. I was part of a U.S. Air Force cover-up for 17 years. I was officer in charge of photo-optical instrumentation at Vandenberg Air Force Base from 1963 to 66. And during that time, I was in charge of a 100-man unit that was responsible for providing engineering sequential photography for every single launch from that Western Test Range, which was at Vandenberg Air Force Base. Our duty was to provide coverage of every launch, because back in those days, 1963, 64, many of the missiles blew up on the pad. And the engineers at Boeing and Douglas and other outfits that were building these missiles needed to know what was happening, what took place frame by frame, second by second, in fact, millisecond by millisecond. We'd have about 30 cameras set up on every single launch. We'd have 3 tracking sites to provide triangulation for the things. And one day I got a call from my Major Florence J. Mansman, who was the optical instrumentation officer at 1st Strategic Air Base Air Command. He called me into his office and said, "Bob, have you ever been up to Big Sur?" And I said, "Well, in my college days, I was a beatnik, and I remembered Lawrence Ferlinghetti speaking his poems at the Nepenthe Cafe in Big Sur." So, yeah, I've been up there. He said, "Well, I want you to go up there, and there's a Forest Service station on Anderson Peak. I want you to go up there and just take a look around and see if it's possible for us to get a line of sight from Big Sur back down to Vandenberg." I said, "Okay." And I hopped in my station wagon and drove up to Big Sur. I met the Forest Service officer there, and he took me up to the Forest Service Road, which you can see here. And we found a place where a prearranged time a missile was launched, and I managed to look down the coast about 160 miles. And yes, we could see the thing from the side. The point was that the engineers wanted to see what was going on from the side view of these missiles. From our positions on Vandenberg, all we could do is look up the tailpipe. So we took a tracking mount up there, and photographed with our little cameras a couple of launches. And sure enough, the engineers were excited to see the side view. Next thing that happened is, after I had established this site, Major Mansman called me and said, I want you to go back up to the site. We're sending something up for you. So I drove back up to Vandenberg, to Big Sur, and suddenly this huge truck came pulling up the Forest Service Road. It was towing a massive telescope, a catadioptric telescope, with a potential focal length of 2,400 inches. I'm sure you photographers in the crowd will know that 25 millimeters for a 60 millimeter camera is, or a 1-inch lens is normal. Imagine a 2,000 inch telescope. That's it that you're seeing on the screen right now. We set this telescope up and did a couple of tests with it, and then something magical happened, something that changed my view of the universe and our position in it. On September 14th, 1964, there was a launch of an Atlas D missile from Vandenberg. And this group that you see here in front, I'm the guy wearing the MG jacket. We were told to wear civilian clothes up there so we didn't get the natives riled up. There was an early morning fog bank. As we looked down the coast toward Vandenberg, suddenly this missile popped out and it flew down range beautifully against the clear sky. We couldn't see what the telescope was seeing. So I need to explain to you why we missed it on the site. This telescope had an image orthicon tube, which was attached to the telescope. So the signal went from the telescope into the image orthicon tube, and a 35 millimeter Mitchell camera was established shooting a picture of the surface of the image orthicon tube. It was called kinescope recording. For those of you old enough to remember kinescope recording from the old days of TV. So it was covered with a black shield and we couldn't see what was in there. Anyhow, we watched this missile go until it went out of our sight, but the 2,000 inch telescope, which at that point had about a focal length of 1,000 inches, locked down on it. We were radar tracking it, locked down on what was in. We couldn't see what was in it. But we were all celebrating, jumping up and down, saying, "Yeah, we got it! The engineers are going to be so happy." And the folks from BU who brought the telescope out to us were happy. And everything settled down. I went back to Vandenberg. 2 days later, I was called by Major Mansman. He said, Lieutenant Jacobs, I want you to come to my office right away. When a major tells you to do something and you're a lieutenant, you do it. So I hustled over to First Strategic Air headquarters. I walked into Major Mansman's office, and I'll describe for you what I saw. There was a table set up in his office, and on the table was a 16 millimeter projector. There was a daylight screen on the wall adjacent to it. There were two men in gray flannel suits. There was Major Mansman and his office over here, and here was the screen. Major Mansman said, "Lieutenant, sit down." And I did. And he said, "Now watch this." He turned the projector on, and the most amazing thing happened. We could see the bottom three stages of that rocket filling the frame from 160 miles away. It was amazing. The clarity was beautiful, and that thing took off, and we watched it go through all three stages of powered flight: stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, and then we saw, incredibly, at a long distance, the thing was now heading for Kwajalein. And the nose cone opened up, and radar chaff, something aluminum foil, spread out in front of it. Here's what the function of the aluminum foil was. We were testing to see if we could launch a nuclear warhead into an orbit slightly above the nuclear chaff so that the Russians would aim their anti-missile missiles at the chaff, and our little warhead would go spoop like this and fly over and obliterate Moscow. That's the game we were playing. It was horrifying to think about in retrospect. Anyhow, as the thing was flying along, we saw the warhead eject in over the chaff, and it was flying along. We're going about 8,000 miles an hour now. And suddenly, from in the frame, we saw an object come in from the same way we were going, 8,000 miles. This object flew in. I'm trying to do something here on the screen so you can see. The object flew in. It came up to our warhead. It went around the top of the warhead, fired a beam of light down onto the top of the warhead, went around to the front of the warhead. We're all traveling at about 8,000 miles an hour here. Fired another beam of light, went down below the warhead, fired another beam of light, went around the way it had come in, fired another beam of light, and then flew out of the frame the same way it had come in. At that point, the warhead tumbled out of space. We had, let me tell you what happened next, just to say it. The lights came on, Major Manson looked at me, the two guys in gray suits looked at me, and Major Manson said, "Were you guys screwing around up there?" And I said, "No, sir." He said, "Then what was that?" And I said, "It looks to me like we got a UFO." Major Manson said, "You are never to say that again. As far as you're concerned, this didn't happen." He said, "You understand?" I said, "Yes, sir." He escorted me to his door to his office, and he said, "Now, I don't need to remind you of the seriousness of a security breach, do I?" I said, "No, sir." He said, "All right, then you're dismissed." But as I left, as I was prepared to leave, he leaned over to speak into my ear to say something that the guys in the suits couldn't see. He said, "Lieutenant, if you were ever tortured in the future, if somebody has you up against the wall and they're frying your privates with fire," he said, "you can tell them this, just to get out of it. Just tell them, oh, it was laser tracking." We didn't have laser tracking in 1964. For 17 years, I shut up. I never said anything to anybody. And then one night, I was doing a late night talk show in Eureka, California, on station KFMI. And the topic of UFOs came up, and I had been muddling with this thing in my mind, because here's what happens, folks. You see something that's totally inexplicable. How in the heck could this thing, and it was, by the way, a flying saucer. It was shaped like a saucer, like a ping pong ball on top, and it was firing a beam of light at our warheads. How could such a thing happen? How could a guy from Compton, California, who'd gone to USC and played a little football and worked for Walt Disney and so on, suddenly have his world shaken up by discovering that we are not alone, that thing was up there, that I saw it, it was on film. And by the way, I'm still alive, barely. When it happened to me, my world changed, my worldview changed, but I was under orders to shut up, so I shut up. Part of UFO, U.S. Air Force cover-up, in fact. Finally, I told my story on my late night radio show one night, and all kinds of strange things happened. I started getting calls from people I didn't know, saying that, "Oh, I had a UFO experience too," and so on and so forth. Let's cut ahead a little ways to, I got a job teaching college at the University of Wisconsin at Oshkosh. And I'm sure you folks in the press must know that we who teach college don't make a lot of money. And I was on a 9-month contract. So in the summer, I decided I needed to make a couple of bucks to pay my rent and so forth. And so I thought, what can I do? I thought, that UFO incident, I'll bet I could sell this to somebody, because UFOs were a topic of concern at the moment. So I wrote an article about my experience, and I shopped it around. It went to Omni magazine, it went to Time, I shopped it around, and no one was interested. So where would you go to sell a UFO story? I called the National Enquirer. And yes, they bought the story. And of course, they took my story and put it in their ridiculous writing style. His jaw dropped. He fell over. Oh, good grief. One of those things that those of us who I used to teach journalism would go, oh my gosh. But I got paid. And then, to put it mildly, the fit hit the jam. Suddenly my world did change. I started getting telephone calls late at night at my home. I'm not going to say the words because I don't want to be censored here, but a voice would say, it always ended up with, "You're going down, MF." You can interpret what MF means. They would leave this message on my, remember answering machines? We used to have those. Well, they would leave the message on my answering machine. They were fearless. One night, my wife and I came home from a movie, and the phone rang, and I picked it up, and the voice said, "Fireworks in your mailbox at night. Oh, what a beautiful sight. You're going down, MF." And there was a boom. My wife and I went to the door. We lived in the country, and we had a rural mailbox. It was on fire. They had blown up my mailbox while I was talking to them on the phone. "You're going down, MF." I put up with that for a couple of weeks, and then I had a friend named John Andrews who worked for the Tester Corporation. He was a UFO researcher. And he said, "What you have to do right now, Bob, is go public more and more." So he set me up to write an article for the MUFON Journal, the Mutual UFO Network Journal. And I did this in journalistic prose, and the immediate threats to me stopped. Having been part of a cover-up for so long, and then having been threatened, having literally had my life threatened, I later lost a job teaching college because a guy named Phil Klass, who was a paid informant of the CIA, we're told, wrote a letter to my supervisor there at the University of Maine saying that I was making up tall tales. I was a journalism professor, and how could a university allow me to continue doing that, and blah, blah, blah. And I was fired. This cover-up has been going on for a long, long time. And those of us who are here today in front of you, Bob Salas, who was a captain in the Air Force, who actually one of those heroes, who sat down in a silo with a key and a partner ready to go into Armageddon if he was ordered to do so. You can't imagine the pressure this man's been under. And what we're here today to tell you is that this is real, that you folks in the press need to get to it and tell the story and tell it correctly, and never mind spin, never mind politics. This has nothing whatever to do with politics. Doesn't matter who's president or who's chief executive of any corporation. This is a real event. It is the most important event in the history of mankind. We are not alone. Bob?
Dr. Jacobs. I'm going to quickly play an animation that was put together. Again, Robert Hastings had a lot to do with this one too. So let me just play that.
The nose cones separate. The chaff flew out in front of it. We saw this as obviously reflections of light rippling like that. And then we saw the dummy warhead flying along. It's going between 6,000 and 8,000 miles an hour at that point, and it's on the fringe of space. And suddenly, into that frame, an object flew in, chasing the chaff, the warhead, and so on, at the same speed. And in polar orbit, it fired a beam of light at the warhead. The beam of light struck that. The object flew up, shot another beam of light at the dummy warhead, went like this, shot another beam of light at it, went down, shot a beam of light, and then flew out the same way it had come in. At which time, the dummy warhead fell out of the frame.
And then we got the statement of, Major Mansman. If I can get to this.
The nose cones separate.
So Major Mansman responded to, I think this was a journalist that wanted more information about this incident, and Major Mansman did support Dr. Jacobs in these letters, and I'll just read a little bit here. "We knew the missile nose cone size, but could not compare since did not know how far from the missile the object was from the missile at the time of the beam release. The shape was classic disc. The center seemed to be raised, bubble. Not sure any ports or slits could be seen, but was stationary or moving slightly, floating over the entire lower saucer shape, which was glowing and seemed to be rotating slowly at the point of beam release." Okay, Dr. Jacobs, any final words?
No. I could tell a couple of tales about the further cover up. Let me just talk because it's kind of funny. One of the researchers who contacted me was Lee Graham, who worked for one of the missile manufacturing companies in Los Angeles. Lee was quite interested in UFOs. He pursued the thing throughout his lifetime. So he contacted me, and I told him my story, and then he went to verify what I had told him. He contacted the Air Force to inquire about Lieutenant Robert M. Jacobs. They told him there was no such Lieutenant Robert M. Jacobs, nor had there ever been. He went to Vandenberg. He said he asked them if there had been a Lieutenant Robert M. Jacobs as officer in charge of optical instrumentation in the 1369 Photo Squadron. He was told no such officer ever existed. He pursued his research. He wondered if there had been a missile launch on September 14th, 1964. He was told there was no such missile launch ever taking place. We continued his investigation, and finally the Air Force had to admit that, well, yes, there had been a Lieutenant Robert M. Jacobs, and yes, he was officer in charge of photo-optical instrumentation at Vandenberg, and yes, there was a missile launch on the date in question. When Lee filed a Freedom of Information Act request to get a copy of the film, he was told no such film existed. And let me verify that it probably doesn't, because there's been some controversy over whether I'm telling the truth, whether Major Mansman is telling the truth, and I assure you that we are. He did. He is passed on, unfortunately. And what we know is that the two guys in gray suits who were in Major Mansman's office that day were with one of the government agencies that are all alphabetized. We believe it was the CIA. They took the reel of film from Major Mansman, they reeled it down, and they snipped off the bit of the film that had the encounter on it. They gave Major Mansman back the rest of the film, and they said to him, "We don't need to remind you of a security breach, do we?" He said, "No, sir." And they walked out of his office with the film in hand. Major Mansman reported how many people had seen the film. And here's who he reported saw it. He saw it, the commanding officer saw it, the chief scientist saw it, I saw it, and one other person saw it. Those are the only people who saw this film. There was a man named Kingston George who was involved in the thing as an engineer with one of the missile companies. He did not see the same film that Major Mansman and I saw. That bit of film went off to God knows wherever the CIA does stuff, and no one has ever seen it since. I've had a couple of so-called investigators who said, "Oh, I got your film, I found your film," and they showed me the film, and I went, no, that's not the film. That's it, Bob.
I'm afraid we're going to have to
Back
move
to you.
on, sir. Thank you very much. I'd like to next introduce David Schindelay, served in active duty Air Force from 1963 to 68. He was a missile launch officer on the Atlas ICBM at Fairchild Air Force Base, Washington, until June of 65. He later served as a missile launch officer at Minot Air Force Base, North Dakota, until 1968. After leaving active duty, he worked as a project manager at Hamilton Standard in the development of the Manned Orbiting Laboratory. He also participated in the development of the Apollo astronaut backpacks used on the moon expeditions. He worked as a computer systems analyst until his retirement in 2004. Mr. Schindelay.
Yes, that is me, more than 50 years ago. Good morning. My name is David Schindley. I'm a retired Air Force captain, and I'm very proud to have served my country. The report released by the Office of Director of National Intelligence, ODNI, on June 25th this year stated the following. UAP, or UFOs, may pose a challenge to U.S. national security. Coming from an important agency of the U.S. government, this statement is very important and very significant. ODNI is the first government agency to ever publicly suggest that national security might be challenged or threatened by unidentified aerial phenomena, or by what the public has always referred to as UFOs, or real objects, which is now inclusive to the government term of aerial phenomena. This summary paragraph from the ODNI report reflects the essence of the report content. Let me point out that it notes that safety concerns primarily center on aviators contending with increasingly cluttered air domain, and that there is a national security challenge if they are foreign adversary collection platforms. Let me be very clear. The ODNI report did not effectively address the substance of UAP, UFO concerns, as specifically directed and requested. The request by the Senate Intelligence Committee to ODNI was to, quote, submit an intelligence assessment of the threat posed by unidentified aerial phenomena, UFOs, and the progress the Department of Defense Unidentified Aerial Phenomena Task Force has made in understanding this threat. The ODNI report provided no indication that historical data will be accessed, which resides deep inside some intelligence agencies, including the CIA and those agencies that ODNI gave its report to. ODNI even admitted, quote, the data set described in this report is currently limited primarily to U.S. government reporting of incidents occurring from November 2004 to March 2021. There has been a long history of UFO incidents and encounters, with much investigation of them from 1947 and even earlier. The U.S. Air Force began its official investigations in 1948 with Project Sign, then Project Grudge in 1949, then Project Blue Book in 1952, until the Air Force took their investigations underground in 1969. For over 20 years, the Air Force was concerned with encounters by the military, with great reason. There is a great deal of evidence from the past, consisting of witness testimony and documentation, which indicates that for many decades, the military has been harassed by UFOs. The objects have shown capabilities far beyond what science, physics, and the technology of today can explain, and they seem to be controlled by highly sophisticated intelligence. They have demonstrated a maneuverability in flight that no human pilot could possibly endure. Now I'm about to inform you of one of those prior UFO incidents that did indeed impact national security. It was an incident that I was involved with, where I had to deal with its ramifications. In September of 1966, I was the Minot ICBM launch control officer and deputy commander of a launch crew stationed at Minot Air Force Base, North Dakota. I was involved in a UFO incident at that time where a flying object tampered with and took down a total of 10 nuclear-tipped ICBM missiles by rendering them unlaunchable. It all began for me early one morning when having breakfast and listening to a television newscast by a TV station in the town of Minot. The newscaster announced that residents of Mohall, North Dakota, saw strange lights west of town that night, which they attributed to a UFO. This caught my attention because I was scheduled to replace the current Minuteman launch crew at November Flight Launch Control Center, which is 3 miles west of that town. When I attended the pre-departure crew briefing on base that morning, where 15 two-man officer crews would meet each morning prior to going to their assigned launch control centers, we were told that a few missiles at November flight had gone off alert, but nothing more was said on this. After the briefing, several missile crews came up to me and mentioned about what they heard on the news that morning, and my crew commander also acknowledged he heard the news. When my crew commander and I arrived at November Flight Launch Control Facility, which was a drab green nondescript building surrounded by a high fence and located 37 miles from base, my commander entered through the front door of the building to debrief security guards. Upon entering the rear door of the building, I was met by the site manager, who was a tech sergeant, and he asked if I heard what happened overnight. I responded by stating I knew that residents of Mohall reported sighting strange lights during the night. He then took me to the day room and its west-facing windows, and he described to me what he and others had seen that night. He described a large object just outside the perimeter fence with bright flashing lights, but without noise, and it hovered close to the ground. I estimated the object to be 80 to 100 feet wide, based on how he gestured its size with his outstretched arms. After many minutes passed, the object then glided to the north end of the building and out of sight. But it then became visible to security guards in the control section of the building. The object, which hovered just outside the main gate, was slightly blocked from view because of the large garage located inside the fence to the right. With security and other personnel viewing the object through security control windows, and with security personnel preferring to remain in the building, it was just a short period of time before the object abruptly took flight, and it disappeared within a second. There were 8 people topside within the building who saw this object, and it included 6 security personnel, a facility cook, and the site manager. They all confirmed it was a terrifying experience to behold, which I could tell by the tone in their voices and the expressions on their faces. They knew the object was not a helicopter, and base choppers normally did not fly at night, especially without notice to the facility. My commander and I then entered the elevator next to the security center, which lowered us 60 feet below ground to where their hardened launch control center capsule was located. When we arrived, the blast door to the capsule was open for us, and we walked in. We were greeted by the 2 officers of the launch crew who were waiting for us, but we also immediately glanced at the launch control console located at the opposite end of the room, which displayed the status of the 10 nuclear-tipped missiles. With the missiles positioned in hardened underground secure silos located many miles away in all directions from us, the lights on the console indicated they were all off alert and unlaunchable. The on-duty crew told us that the missiles went down when the flying object was hovering next to the main gate and above the underground capsule. The crew was communicating with the head security guard topside during the entire time of the incident. The crew discussed this situation extensively with my commander and I, and then we all went through the formalities of crew changeover. When the crew left, we closed the blast door behind them, and then my commander and I settled in to monitor our 10 inoperable nuclear-tipped ICBM missiles. All the missiles indicated guidance and control system malfunction. At other times during crew changeover at launch centers, we might note 1 or 2 missiles down for scheduled maintenance, but never had we seen a situation like this. It was all new to us, and it was so very disturbing and troubling to us when attempting to comprehend the reality of the situation that had come our way. But we also had a forewarning, and that was followed by the emotions exhibited by airmen topside and by the officer crew below ground briefing us on actions they took during the incident. The next morning, after we were relieved by another crew, we arrived topside. I attempted to further question the head security guard about the incident and on what he saw. But he interrupted me and said he was instructed not to talk to anyone about it. And then my commander turned toward me and said he had received a call overnight from the Office of Special Investigations, the OSI, while I was on a rest break below ground. My commander was told by the OSI that we were to forever keep our lips zipped about the incident. And he was told that, as far as you're concerned, it never happened. We were even instructed to never talk to each other again about the incident. In effect, the Air Force confirmed to me the seriousness and reality of the UFO incident. Ironically, this was verified by the fact that my crew commander and I were never questioned, never interrogated, never debriefed on the incident, and neither was the other crew. It amazed us that we were not questioned. Instead, we were only told in no uncertain terms to keep quiet. We were never told what the security classification of the incident was. We were never instructed or trained on what to do if another incident should ever happen again. And other missile crews were never informed of our incident or of the other UFO incidents in the missile field at the time. We missileers all possess top secret clearances, and we were under constant review and training to ensure that our technical skills and ability to follow complex procedures met high stringent requirements. We are all well educated, psychologically profiled, and responsible for our nuclear security and operational readiness and maintaining our nation's primary line of defense. It was a serious game of nuclear deterrence, and we were trusted to launch our missiles upon receipt of a verified and authenticated order. We knew it involved the preservation of freedom and liberty for the American people. And we knew an attacking aggressor would think twice when facing us in a tense Cold War situation. We are proud to serve our country in that way. Many airmen involved with this incident have passed away, including my crew commander. But the commander of the crew that my commander and I relieved, he is still around. After suggesting many times to him that he come forward as I have, he said, "You need to understand that after I returned to base after the incident, I was ordered to sign a document stating I would forever remain silent." His trepidation about that and his personal integrity keeps him silent to this day, 55 years later. We are all proud of our integrity, and the Air Force relied on us because of it. However, the Air Force has not been honest with Congress and the American public. When the Air Force closed Project Blue Book in 1969, after my incident in 1966, and many others incidents, the conclusions of the project were, number one, there was no evidence that sightings categorized as unidentified were extraterrestrial vehicles. I'm sorry, I hit the wrong slide here. How do I get back? Keep going. Okay. Okay, now I forgot where it was. Unfortunately, I'm reading a script here, but okay, when the Air Force closed Project Blue Book in 1969, after my incident, the number one conclusion was there is no evidence that sightings categorized as unidentified were extraterrestrial vehicles. And number two, no UFO reported, investigated, and evaluated by the Air Force gave an indication of a threat to our national security. The U.S. Air Force currently states on its website that since the termination of Project Blue Book, nothing has occurred that would support a resumption of UFO investigations by the Air Force. Let me get the slides, please. Right here. The Air Force continues with its proclamation that UFOs do not exist or pose a threat to national security. I was held hostage to both those lies for about 40 years. And it is past time for the truth to come out and be revealed. Congress and the intelligence community have a responsibility here. And others must be released from the burden of holding back the truth. On February 28, 1960, an article in the New York Times featured Roscoe H. Hillenkotter, who was installed as the first director of the CIA on September 18, 1947. Prior to becoming the CIA director, Hillenkotter was director of the U.S. Central Intelligence Group, which was during the time of the famous Roswell incident in July of 1947. The article in the Times began as follows. The Air Force has sent its commands a warning to treat sightings of unidentified flying objects as serious business, directly related to the nation's defense. In other words, national security. But you'll note that there was no notice to Project Blue Book, Congress, or the public on this by the Air Force. And then that article quoted Hillenkotter with the following. It is time for the truth to be brought out in open congressional hearings. This was in 1960. Behind the scenes, high-ranking Air Force officers are soberly concerned about the UFOs. But through official secrecy and ridicule, many citizens are led to believe the unknown flying objects are nonsense. To hide the facts, the Air Force has silenced its personnel. That was in 1960, but 6 years after that statement, I was one of those that Hillenkotter was referring to as being silenced. His prophecy. That has now changed. I stand here before you today. I respectfully suggest that Odie and I take another serious look at its report, because I am willing to testify on all of this before a congressional hearing. Thank you for being here, and thank you for listening. And one thing I need to do before I leave is introduce our host, Robert Salas. Captain Salas holds several degrees. One as a Bachelor of Science degree in Basic Science from the U.S. Air Force Academy. He has a master's degree in Aerospace Engineering and a Master's of Science degree in Education. He was in active duty from 1964 to 1971 and included weapons controller. He was a target drone pilot, a missile crew commander in the Minuteman I, a Titan III missile propulsion engineer, and he later worked for the FAA and aircraft certification for 22 years. He was also an educator for 17 years. Robert Salas is very special to me. I wouldn't have come out and started talking if it wasn't for him. I had been searching the internet in the later 1990s, trying to find information on my incident and seeing if there was any documents out there if anybody was talking. I didn't find anything and I gave up. In 2001, I found an article on the internet describing Robert Salas's incident. And when I saw that, I said, oh my God, it's been verified. the incident that he had was almost identical to the one I had. And I experienced just a joyful freedom. And I finally was able to tell my wife my secret. And so, thanks, Robert, for helping me out.
Thank you. Thank you, Dave. If any of you present are looking for a front page statement, I think this could be it. In March of 1967, UFOs disabled 20 nuclear missiles within the span of 8 days. If you include Dave Schindeli's incident, within 6 months, UFOs shut down 30 nuclear missiles. There's no question about this, as far as we're concerned. I think the testimony is overwhelming. I'm going to talk just real briefly about what the facilities look like. This is shows the Oscar flight. That photograph shows the front gate of Oscar flight, where I was located during my incident. The one image below it shows the cutaway view of where the capsule is, about 60 feet underground. And that's where we were locked in. I think Dave mentioned the huge door we had there. And then the next one's the launch facility. That's where the missiles are actually located. They're about a mile away on average from the Launch Control Center in a kind of a ring around that central point. So one of the first witnesses I was able to find for those March incidents was Colonel Walter Fiegel. Colonel Fiegel is still alive and well. I spoke to him fairly recently, within months ago, and he couldn't be here with us today, but I'm sure he would be more than happy to testify before Congress. And I'll just play the conversation that we had this was, I think, 1996 when we had this conversation, when I had first located him.
Back and forth to base to you. Because they were doing maintenance on, I don't know, the guidance cans or something. And the maintenance crews were staying over, and there was security and maintenance on site on both, on 2 of the 10 sites. And when the first one went down, and I talked to the security out there, they had reported this UFO hovering over the site. And I said, yeah, right, what are you guys drinking out there? And we struck strike teams to both of the sites that had been occupied. And both strike teams, I didn't tell them what we had heard via the LF radio. And I told them to go to get within a mile of the site and call back in on the VHF. And they both had reported it too. So we had 2 maintenance crews, 2 security troops on site, and 2 strike teams all reporting it.
Is that right?
Yep.
Do you remember any of the names of any of those guys?
Nope.
You don't?
So right after I talked to Colonel Fiegel, I gave him the information of Eric Carlson, who was his commander in the capsule at the time. You see on the map on the right-hand side there, you see it's circled where Echo Flight was located, about 100 miles to the east of Great Falls, Montana, near a town called Lewiston. And then after a while, I got these letters from Commander Carlson. As far as I know, Commander Carlson is still alive, although I haven't heard from him in quite a while. And in these 2 messages that I received from him, the first one, he confirms what Colonel Fiegel just told us about the Echo Flight shutdown, and also confirmed the fact that SAC headquarters sent people out there to interview both of them. So they both had interviews. One of them, I think Colonel Fiegel told me, was with SINCSAC, or Commander-in-Chief of Strategic Air Command at the time. And Carlson also said we had his permission to use his name associated with this, and that UFO sightings were fairly common. One of the first documents we received under the Freedom of Information Act was this document. It confirms the Echo flight shutdown and the very grave concern the Strategic Air Command headquarters had because they could not understand how this could happen. All 10 missiles in Echo flight at Malmstrom lost strategic alert within 10 seconds of each other. The fact no apparent reason for the loss of 10 missiles can be readily identified is cause for grave concern to this headquarters. It goes on to state that we need an immediate investigation, and that's when the Boeing got involved. Boeing had the overall oversight of the weapons system, the Minuteman I missile system, and they organized a large investigative team. The Air Force also had an investigative team, but that was done in secret. Another document we received was this one. This was part of the quarterly report that Malmstrom Air Force Base Wing was supposed to do, send to SAC headquarters on a quarterly basis. And one of the documents we got back says, rumors of unidentified objects, UFO, around the area of Echo flight at the time of the fault were disproven. So essentially, the Air Force is stating they have proven a negative. In other words, they have proven that something did not happen. So I don't know how that's done, but that's what it says here in an official document. We later wrote to Airman David Gamble, who wrote these documents for the Malmstrom Missile Wing, and he stated, I don't recall interviews with the Mobile Strike Team or anyone in the radar squadron. What I do recall is there was a general unwillingness to discuss the subject by anyone I contacted. There are 2 times that I recall when sections of the history were scrutinized and changes were made beyond editorial. These were UFO sightings history, so he confirms that there has been a history at Malmstrom Air Force Base of UFO sightings, and reported morale problem in the Fighter Interceptor Squadron. That's from David Gamble. One of the things that was suspected could have caused these failures, and again, at Echo Flight and also my incident at Oscar Flight, the feedback we got from the system was guidance and control system failure. We had an inertial guidance system, which means that there were gyros involved. There was also something called a stable platform, where these gyros were installed, and it held accelerometers and things like that, that once the missile was launched, these accelerometers would provide data to the computer to calculate speed and also direction. And so it was one of the theories by Boeing, and they did a bench test, was that this stable platform was simply disrupted to the point where it was useless as far as calculating the position of the missile after launch, and therefore could not be launched. This is one statement, again, from an official document we received. It was the opinion of the team, this was the Air Force investigative team, that externally generated signals caused the generation of the 2 channels and shutdown of the launch facilities. The possibility of this is very remote due to the fact that all 10 couplers would have to fail in the flight within a few seconds of each other. So to extrapolate a little bit, the missiles were not interconnected in this way. They all had individual separate inertial guidance systems. So what this is saying is each of those guidance systems would have had to been externally, there had to be an external signal to each one separately within seconds of each other in order for this to happen, a near impossibility. One of the individuals that contacted us after I went public was Robert Kaminsky. He was the head of the Boeing investigative team that went out to the Echo flight facilities. And here's what he states: there were no significant failures, engineering data, or findings that would explain how 10 missiles were knocked off alert. The final report would have nothing significant in it to explain what happened at Echo flight. I was contacted by a representative and told by him the incident report as being a UFO event. A few days later, we were told to stop any further effort on this project. We were also told we were not to submit a final engineering report. This was told to them by the Air Force. This was most unusual since all of our work required review by the customer and submittal of a final engineering report. There was a good reason for this, why the Air Force told them to cease and desist their investigation, and I'll get into that in a minute. Right now, I want to talk about the Belt sighting, which happened on March 24th, 1967. Basically, a truck driver was driving through the town of Belt, about 30 miles, I think, south of Great Falls. He looks out to his left side, and there he sees a bright white object tracking him and pacing him, actually the same speed, 40 or 50 miles an hour. He stopped. The light hovered over. That photograph on the right is called Frenchman's Coulee, right near Belt. It hovered over that coulee, three bright flashes of light, and then it landed in the coulee. The truck driver called the highway patrol. Patrolman Bud Nader came out. He also saw the object there, landed at the coulee, and they both saw the object rise up from the coulee and fly off. And then they called the Air Force and the sheriff's office. They also came to the site, saw the object come back and land again. It landed, broke some tree branches, which were later discovered. Now, this was seen by many civilian and military witnesses, in fact, even over Malmstrom Air Force Base. There were articles written in the newspapers. And the reason I bring this up is because of my next witness, Robert Jameson. He was on active duty Air Force from 1965 to 1972. While on active duty, he commanded the ICBM combat targeting team at Malmstrom Air Force Base from 65 to 67. He served as a missile targeting instructor at Chanute Air Force Base from 67 to 70, and as a targeting section commander at Minot Air Force Base, North Dakota from 1970 to 72. He later worked as a traffic engineer for the California Department of Transportation. Captain Jameson.
Thank you, Bob. My name is Robert Jameson, and I was a combat targeting officer at Malmstrom Air Force Base during the incident that we're talking about tonight, or this afternoon. Principally, my job was to point the missile in the right direction. It involves more than that. It involves smoke and mirrors and a whole bunch of other stuff. But generally, it's to point the direction, tell the missile which way to go. And also, if a missile falls off alert for no reason whatsoever, we have to go back and completely retarget it, because we don't know what caused the missile to go off alert and whether or not it corrupted the targeting information. So we had to do the whole thing over again. I was on alert one night, and I got a call from Job Control. Job Control is the people that keep track of all maintenance. And a missile had gone down in Oscar flight. And he asked me to go and start it up. Well, that's bad news, because Oscar flight is 160 miles from the base. And 160 miles on those Air Force trucks, no. So I had to go out anyway and did restart the missile. When I got to the hangar, after I called my team ready to go, I walked into the hangar, and some of my friends came up and says, "Bob, did you hear what happened?" No, I didn't hear what happened. It says there was a UFO. The sheriff in Roy, Montana, the little burg outside Lewiston, Montana, Roy, Montana, reported a UFO in the area, told the Air Force, and at the same time, 10 missiles in Oscar flight went off alert. Well, this is very, very unusual. I don't know if there's any incidents where 2 missiles went off alert at the same time, but the missiles to go off alert for no reason at all, it doesn't happen really. We do take missiles off alert for maintenance and other reasons, but to go off alert for no reason and then have 10 missiles to go off alert, it's never happened before. Well, it happened a week before that. And Bob was the launch commander at that time. So they sent me out. Well, first of all, they gave me the targeting information, told you aren't going to start 1 target, you're going to start 4 targets, or 4 missiles. And he said, but don't leave yet. We're going to have to wait until all the activity out there dies down. But they told me there was also a flying saucer or a truck driver going down Belt Canyon and reported a UFO. And we have a group out there right now involving the wing commander and some other big wheels. Just watching it. It's at the bottom of a canyon now. They can't send anybody. It was nighttime. They aren't going to send anybody down to the canyon at nighttime. They aren't going to send any helicopters down at the nighttime. But as soon as it gets light, they're going to do that. As soon as it got light and the helicopter started going down, the thing shot up between the 2 and disappeared. So that's near Belt, Montana. And Bob has talked a little bit about that too. But getting back to the missiles that we put back on alert, and the next day I was out on again, and I was talking to one of the, what we call a strike team. They're airmen, military, air police. Well, security. Yeah. And he was out at the site during the previous night. And he's telling me, I said, did you see anything? He says, yes, I remember seeing way out in the distance, there's a red dot. But I see the red dot getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and they're coming closer and closer and closer. All of a sudden, a few miles out, it split into 2 dots. And they came right over top of me, and then this guy started breaking down, and I says, okay, forget about it. And I understand there's several, more than one of these guys are just right out of high school, so they're very young. And several were affected by what happened, and they were transferred, which is a good thing. But the most important thing, even though I never saw a flying saucer or a UFO, I do know they exist because they have they knocked down our missiles. That just doesn't happen every day. They knock down our missiles, and they're very, very interested in our defense, our national defense. They're very interested in our nuclear weapons and our methods of delivering nuclear weapons. And that's what concerns me, is the problem with national defense. And that's really why we're here today. Congress is going to take a look at this because the defense of the nation depends upon this. It depends upon what we have and what they have. I don't think they're going to destroy. I'm not scared of them, but I'm just kind of concerned.
I just have to say, Robert Jameson has had difficulty walking, and it was very courageous of him to come talk to us today. I'm going to get into my incident, the Oscar flight shutdown, and again, Robert just validated the fact that it happened on March 24th, 1967. That's how we were able to come up with that date. And this was just, again, 8 days after the Echo flight shutdown. At first, I thought I was at Echo because it seemed the way it was described seemed like that's where I was. But when I spoke with my commander in the capsule at the time, and this is Colonel Fred Mywald, you see on the right-hand side there, he informed me that no, we were not at Echo flight, we were at Oscar flight, which is a different flight altogether, but as you can see from those diagrams, all the flights look pretty much the same. So let me play this.
I don't recall, I just remember our side of it. Yeah. All right, here's the sequence I remember. I remember receiving a call first, and the security guard said, I've seen some UFOs up here flying around, and I said, forget it. I didn't believe him. I kind of hung up on him, and then a little while later, I don't know how long it was, maybe 5-10 minutes, maybe longer, they called back, and the guy sounded real scared, and said there was one just outside the front gate, and he also said, I recall, that one of the other guards had gotten injured in some way. I don't think it was from the UFO. I think it was from trying to climb the fence or something like that. And then I hung up, or he hung up because he had to go. This guard got injured, and then I believe you were either getting up or I woke you up, and then some of our missiles started shutting down. Is that right? Is that about how you remember it? Right. We had security alarms and problems at a couple of the sites. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Well, I'm sure glad I found you.
Yeah, I contacted Colonel Mywald finally in 1996. That's when we had that conversation. And then, so just to recap, I got 2 calls that night. First call, lights in the sky from the flight security controller upstairs. Strange maneuvers. Not an airplane, sir. No engine noise. Can't fly that fast. Making 90-degree turns. Stopping on a dime, reversing course, that kind of thing. Not an airplane, sir. And I kind of said, well, what do you mean, UFOs? And he said, well, I can't explain it. And I kind of shrugged it off and hung up. The next time he called, he was very, very frightened. I could tell by his voice. He was shouting into the phone, screaming and saying that there's this lighted object about 40 feet in diameter. It looked like an oval shape, but he couldn't be sure because it was so bright, a bright orange, a red-orange light pulsating. Had the guards all out there with their weapons drawn, wanted me to tell them what to do next. At that point, I did think we were under some kind of an attack. I told him to make sure the place was secure. And then he said he had to go. One of his guards got injured. It turns out the guard had cut his hand on barbed wire around the fenced area, and that's what happened there. And then we also got indicator lights showing incursions at a couple of launch facilities. So that's what this next conversation is about. If I can get it going.
Any reports from their field about UFOs? So I remember the 2 guards that had gone out to one of the sites finally got back scared to death, and we had to relieve them of duty. Yeah. Oh, you mean our guards? Yeah. Oh, I didn't know that. Yeah, and rhythm patrol type. Oh, I guess they had gone out to one of the sites on the LF, and on the way back, they lost radio contact, and we ended up having to send them back to base early. I'm not sure what happened. I don't think they ever returned to guard duty. And what were they scared about? Well, they had seen these crazy things. Then oh, they did? Yeah. They reported that to you? They reported it to the topside guy. Oh, the topside guy. That's right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Well, interesting, don't you think? Yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately, Colonel Mywalt passed about 10 years ago. What was going on at this time was the Condon investigation. In 1966, around August of 66, the University of Colorado was given a contract by the Air Force and to study the UFO question at Air Force bases. In the statement of the contract, which was no bid, by the way, it was stated that the Condon investigators would have access to all UFO reports. That means all Blue Book reports, of course, but they were not told that Blue Book had classified reports. At any rate, at the time of the Echo and Oscar flight incidents, this man here to the top left, Ray Fowler, was a manager for Sylvania. Sylvania had an electrical systems contract with the Air Force on the Minuteman I system, so he had representatives at Malmstrom Air Force Base who actually saw these objects and talked to some of the principals involved. So Ray Fowler called the chief investigator for Condon, a man by the name of Roy Craig, and we were able to retrieve some of Craig's notes, which are held in archives at one of the universities. I think it's Texas A&M, if I'm not mistaken. But at any rate, in one of the notes, obviously he took when he talked to Fowler. Again, the date of March 24th is named only for the shutdown of Echo, but we know Echo happened on March 16th because of that telegram we had. But he states March 24th, which was probably a reference to Oscar flight. He then writes a letter to Robert Lowe, who's the deputy to Condon, and tells him that he has heard that these incidents occurred, Echo and Oscar losing all 10 missiles to UFOs, and should we follow up on this? Well, Robert Lowe writes back and says, no, this classified report is going to be too high for us to look at. So besides, they told us that it was probably a nuclear test that caused the missiles to shut down because they gave off EMP whenever there's a nuclear test. Well, we actually checked. Actually, my investigator, James Klotz, who's a terrific investigator, checked with AEC, and they said there were no nuclear tests at the time. So, but what happened here was that the Condon investigators simply dropped the ball here. They no longer investigated the Echo or Oscar flight incidents, even though they had names, lots of names of people to talk to, including the two crews, et cetera. And as a result, as was previously mentioned, the Air Force issued this fact sheet in I think January of 1969. Blue Book canceled based on the Condon scientific study. Well, it wasn't a scientific study. Condon himself admitted this in an interview to a physics magazine. I've got a transcript of that interview, and stated they didn't look at any hypothesis. They didn't try to prove anything. It was not a scientific study. And again, as was stated, no UFO reported, investigated by the Air Force was ever an indication of threat to our national security. And this is a blatantly false statement. The Air Force knew it. They know it today. They know it's a false statement because they did an investigation on it. And somewhere in the archives of the Air Force is a classified investigation of Echo and Oscar flights. We even have a reference to that, a name of the investigative report. And so they have blatantly lied to the public since 1969 about the fact that these incidents were, in fact, national security related. I'm going to turn now real quickly to the story of Major Bradford Runyon, Minot Air Force Base, North Dakota, 1968. He was a co-pilot of B-52 coming back to land at Minot when he was ordered by a general officer to go around and fly around this launch facility, part of the Minot missile field, and just look, see if you can see something down there. So he did, and this diagram at right on the right side is a result. It shows an object on the ground, an orange color with a kind of a tunnel between that and a kind of a crescent-shaped part of it, which was colored a very bright green. These were the colors he described. Anyway, I'll play the testimony here of Major Runyon.
Then an alarm goes off in one of the missile silos, and well, anyway, so turns out that this is what was told to us at the briefing by a general officer the following day. So air police were dispatched to check on the missile alarm, and so the first air policemen that were sent out didn't check in when they should have, so they sent others to check on them, and the second group found the first group unconscious around their vehicle with the paint burned off the top of their vehicle. And when they came to, they said that you know, something, some object had, they thought was going to sit down on top of them, and so they started running. That was the last that they knew, but undoubtedly it didn't squash their vehicle or anything, so it didn't sit down on them. And but anyway, it turns out that the reason that the alarms were set off is a 20-ton concrete lid covering the top of the missile silo had been removed, and chain link fence around the thing had been squashed. There was radioactivity around, and the inner alarm down inside the silo had also been activated. Well, it turns out that there were two ways to remove the concrete lid. You either have a large crane that will lift 20 tons and set it off to the side, or have explosive charges that blow it off in case one launches the missile and go to war. The explosive charges hadn't been activated.
But so these things aren't on a mechanism that...
No.
They're just...
It's just sitting. It's just a big concrete lid that's sitting on top of it.
If they want to fire that missile, man, they have to blow that...
No, they blow it off, yeah.
So, but the thing was moved to the side?
Yeah, it was just off to the side someplace. It wasn't on top of the missile silo anyway.
Now, and there's a chain link fence?
Yes,
tight around the silo?
Well, just to keep, mainly keep animals out, and I guess people, and but part of it had been flattened, just squashed. And there weren't any tracks around other than, you know, just right there at the chain link fence.
Now we want to point out that the written account of this sighting doesn't say anything.
No, this is just told to us. Well, that's why it was such of an important nature to the Air Force, because of the missile being checked out.
Yeah. So,
This is a very well-researched incident, and I would advise any of you who are interested in following up and getting more details to go to this website here that I have on the screen. But like I say, a lot of work was done, not only with Major Runyon, but there were other witnesses to this, very well researched. I'm gonna move on quickly since we're running out of time to Captain Bruce Fenstermacher. Again, he testified at the citizens' hearing on disclosure, and there's the websites you can go to see more of that hearing. And here is Captain Fenstermacher.
I was a captain in the Air Force and a Minuteman III combat crew commander from 1974 to 1977. I was stationed at F.E. Warren Air Force Base in Wyoming and assigned to the 400th Strategic Missile Squadron. In the fall of '76, my deputy and I were on duty at Romeo Launch Facility, or LCF. Approximately 2 a.m., the FSC called the SAT and said, "Hey, pull over. Get out of the vehicle and look around." That's all he said. Gave no direction or any guidance. A few seconds, and he also said, "See what you see." A few seconds later, they reported they saw nothing, and they said, "Oops, wait a minute, we do see something in the distance." The FSC, "Well, what do you see?" And they said in an excited voice, it was a light in the sky, it was a bright white pulsating light, and they could see some other colors in between the pulsations. The FSC asked them where the light was located, and the reply was that it was some distance to the north. And then after a pause, they said, "Geez, it really looks like it's near the LCF, or near where you are." The FSC then asked the SAT to return back to the launch control facility. My deputy and I kind of looked at each other and did a double take, because what the heck was that all about? So we called the FSC on our hotline and asked them what was going on. He very calmly said that right now, right above the LCF, there was a silent object with a very white pulsating light. Between the pulsations, he could see a red and blue. I asked for specifics, and his best guess, well, he said it was a fat cigar. It looked like a fat cigar. And his best guess was that it was 80 to 100 feet above the ground and 40 to 50 feet long. It was hard to see his perspective exactly, because he didn't know how close. If it was way high, it could have been 1,000 feet long. If it was way low, it could have been less. But that was his best guess. Right after the group communication, the crew from Quebec called. They were the team we had dropped off on the way to Romeo, and said that earlier that morning, they had a similar object above a couple of their launch facilities.
Okay, I'm going to cut it a little short there. The next area I'd like to talk about is nuclear weapons storage bases, NATO bases, starting from sometime in the 70s until possibly the present time. And this was a quote I have from the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. It's a well-known group that monitors nuclear weapons activity throughout the world. It says at the peak of the Cold War, more than 7,000, as many as 24 different types of tactical or non-strategic nuclear weapons were deployed by the United States through the NATO framework in Europe. The role of the weapons was to buttress deterrence of Soviet military strike by countering the perception that after the Warsaw Pact, NATO conventional forces were inferior to Soviet conventional forces. Some of the U.S. tactical nuclear weapons, which were stationed in Belgium, Germany, Greece, Italy, the Netherlands, Turkey, and the United Kingdom, are still there. So this is just a validation of the fact that we had tactical, and maybe still do have tactical nuclear weapons in Europe. Now these tactical nuclear weapons are smaller weapons. They're still about the size of the ones that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I just want to point to 3 incidents. There have been many. One at Aviano Air Base, Italy, in July of 1977. Master Sergeant Roger Furry was on duty near what's called the Alert Facility, where they had interceptor pilots standing by in case needed. This lighted object comes over, a very bright light, hovers over that facility or nearby, and again just flies off. He said the light had a strong glare. It made it difficult to describe the shape of the object. As it hovered, the light changed from yellow to orange to red in a gradual manner. I could hear a humming sound like bees buzzing. There was also a high amount of static electricity in the air, and you could feel it. The object appeared to be about 7,500 feet in diameter. Sergeant Furry and others observed it for about 5 minutes. The next one, Schosterberg Air Base, the Netherlands. February 2nd, a young teenager named Josie Zwinenberg was riding her horse next to the base and saw very clearly this very large UFO hovering right near the fence that would connect to the base. The next day, there were 12 witnesses at the air base as this object. You see a sketch that was described, and it flew down the flight line, observed by 12 witnesses who went on the radio, by the way, that evening and talked about this. That testimony is available, again, a transcript of that testimony, the actual audio of those witnesses describing this object fly slowly down the flight line, shining a beam of light, apparently pointing out the storage of the nuclear weapons on base. The next one I'll talk about is RAF Bentwaters, United Kingdom, right around Christmas time, 1980. And Colonel Charles Halt was a principal witness to that. In 2010, he gave us an affidavit, and I'll just read from that. This object then moved back towards Bentwaters and continued to send down beams of light at one point near the weapons storage area. In keeping with official Air Force policy, I can neither confirm or deny that the weapons storage area held nuclear weapons. However, I am aware that other former or retired Air Force security police who worked there at the time of the incident are now on the record confirming the presence of tactical nuclear bombs at the weapons storage area. So that's the end of the testimony that we're going to present today. I just want to, again, commend Robert Hastings. He literally wrote the book, UFOs and Nukes. I would highly recommend, again, if you're serious about this subject, to read that. And finally, some concluding remarks. And I'll just read them. I fully realize the acceptance of the reality of this phenomenon is a giant leap for a lot of people. We all tend to be comfortable with what we already think we know and don't want to rock the boat or change our perceptions of things. But we humans have had to deal with all sorts of new things in our evolutionary path. In the coming days and months, I think we'll all have to deal with this reality because there is abundant and sober evidence, past and present, for the reality of UAP. It's undeniable. It is not swamp gas or any other quirk of nature. Indeed, the evidence that there is some intelligence and intent behind the UAP has been established by the testimonies we presented and many more which have yet to be presented. With the recent ODNI report, even our government has now publicly acknowledged its reality. The question is, can we finally get the court of public opinion to consider and accept it? Can we all give it the attention it deserves, even with everything else that deserves our attention? The cold fact is, whether we like it or not, whether it is convenient or not, the UAP reality is here. And by the way, nuclear weapons are our own inventive way we use to terminate one war. It is also a way that we could be used for the complete annihilation of humanity and other life on Earth. In my opinion, just my opinion, UFOs are simply reminding us that we should seriously try to eliminate these weapons. I don't think any of us want to be looking through keyholes to know what our government is unnecessarily hiding from us. We must demand open and public hearings on this subject. Let us hear from other witnesses, government agencies, and anyone else who has been holding these secrets. We have a critical need to know. Thank you for your attention. And we'll entertain questions in the time we have left. Okay. Yes, the lady will come around with a mic.
Thank you for doing this, by the way. Great presentation. Considering the fact that these guys have basically been lying for the past 80 years, are you somewhat concerned with the threat narrative that's being created now? Meaning the effect that that's going to have on the public, or for that matter, governmental policy going forward? I mean, because you mentioned here that you don't necessarily think it's a threat. You think it's more along the lines of this kind of reminder that nuclear weapons are dangerous, you guys are going to kill yourself, et cetera, et cetera. But the narrative that these guys are creating is pretty much unverifiable. It's coming from government sources, and the government is basically the one that's saying this is what is taking place. Does that concern you going forward?
Well, again, like I said originally, we're not trying to prove anything. This is not a scientific exercise or a mathematical proof demonstration or anything like that. What we are doing, and what all these witnesses who've had the courage to come forward are doing, is simply telling their stories. We have stated, yes, that the government has withheld secrets intentionally. And now I think the next question is, how will the Air Force answer, for example, what we've stated here today? Yes.
Hi, I'm Travis Tritton. I'm the Pentagon Bureau Chief for military.com. Thanks for doing this. You had mentioned the ODNI report from June, and of course the larger context here is the relatively newer witnesses and film evidence that we've gotten from the Navy, from the Nimitz in 2004, and then from the training areas in the Atlantic more recently. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts or feelings about that. Do you feel like you've been ignored? And what do you think has been the change? Why do you think things are suddenly different, and we have Washington taking this so seriously now? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I'll give it a try and then ask these other guys if they want to comment. Have we been ignored? Well, I've been speaking about this for about 25 years or more. So, yeah, this is the fifth time, at least the fifth time I've spoken at this venue on this very particular subject. The media took it seriously each time. They wrote columns, they wrote, and there was commentary written about it. And then they seemed to get lost. The subject seemed to kind of go away. The reason it's different this time, and you put your finger on it, I think, is those videos released by the Navy through the help of, I think, Lou Elizondo and Chris Mellon. We have to commend them for getting those released. And the Navy admitting, yeah, there's something happened here we can't explain. And you heard from the pilots, right? So that's different. And also this statement that I quoted from the ODNI report stating that these probably represent real objects. So that's the first time I've ever heard a government official make a statement like that in my lifetime. You guys want to add anything? No? I did answer your question, sir? Oh, yeah, Bob.
I just want to respond to, have we been ignored? Shut up. We've been silenced. We've been ridiculed. We've had our lives disrupted. This is more than just being ignored. We've been treated like imbeciles. You'll notice, by the way, that we're all pretty old, which means that our testimony is going to go away in real time here. What I've discovered since I got old is that old people have a superpower. We're invisible. Nobody pays any attention to us. We're just old timers and old goats, and what do we know? What we've told you today, what you've heard from these three guys and from this old bird out here in the Ozarks, is that this is a real thing that's happening to us. I saw it with my own eyes on film that I was in charge of taking at Big Sur, California. That UFO knocked one of our dummy nuclear warheads out of space. It shot it down. To me, that looks like a shot across the bow from a superior force going, hey, knock it off. And for our government, for the U.S. Air Force part of our government, at any rate in my case, to shut it up, to silence it, to tell me it never happened, to say shut up, don't talk about it, indicates that our government is lying to us. Have they lied to us in the past? Well, let me see. Remember the Vietnam conflict? Remember Robert McNamara? Remember all that business about peace with honor and all that crap that came out of our government? Robert McNamara, just a few years ago, came out and said Vietnam was a mistake. We shouldn't have done it. We were lied to we're continuing to be lied to. I told you this is not about politics. I don't believe in politics when it comes to UFOs. You folks are all sitting there wearing masks and all that stuff. Well, these are a bug or is it not a bug? That isn't what this is about. This is about something that's more important than I can possibly explain to you. It's about the possibility of our survival. If these guys, if these things, if these creatures from wherever they are, or whatever time they are, or whatever place they are, get mad at us enough, they can annihilate our entire species just like that. They have the technology and the power that we can't even imagine. Their science is to us magic. And yeah, I think we've probably been entitled to some of that information, but I'm telling you folks in the press, we need to get Congress to listen to us. We need to get the message out to people that, okay, we're old and invisible, but the facts that we're telling you are terribly, terribly important. Bob?
Thank you, Robert. Yes, Billy Cox. Well, I'll refer you to Mr. Hastings again. I know he was in contact with certain individuals. Again, these are or were at the time serving members of the Air Force and did not want to come forward. Now, whether or not that's changed or whether or not that would change if we had open hearings is a good question, but I think there is some validity to that incident. This happened in 2010. A large object was seen near Francis E. Warren, which is in Wyoming, and 50 missiles, which the Air Force has admitted, 50 missiles shut down. That's about all I'll say to that. Okay.
Gentlemen, how you doing? Thank you, David, and the three Roberts for doing this. So my question here is 2 points I would like to touch on here. We've heard in this subject the CIA, DIA, and now the Navy, a branch of the military that has been encountered with this UAP phenomenon. Surprisingly, the branch that you represent, the Air Force, and the Air Force intelligence has been really quiet, or I haven't seen any data come from this branch specifically. So where's we need to have pressure there at some point to uncover whatever data they've been sitting on for decades. That's one point. The second point you just touched on is there's something that's happened more recently around nuclear facilities that we probably won't hear of for another 10, 20 years as people start retiring or coming off their command shifts that have happened since then. So those are my questions.
You guys want to respond to that?
Well, you're right. I was active for 5 years. And I decided to get out of the Air Force. But I'm sure there's current Air Force people who are afraid to lose their jobs if they speak out. Not only that, but when you're in the Air Force, you're trained to do what you're told. If you're told to keep a secret, you keep a secret. It's very important, especially if you have a top secret clearance or something like that. It could be serious trouble. So, yeah, I think this stuff is happening today, and there are people in the Air Force today who are afraid to speak out. And you're right, 10, 20 years from now, yeah, they might do that just like we have. I waited 40 years before I opened my mouth, and that's a long time. And I had this terrible secret on my mind for all that time. And I felt such great relief to finally admit to my friends and close relatives what I've experienced in the Air Force. And my hope is that the Air Force will start to come clean on all this stuff.
Okay, I think Mr. Bassett deserves the last question, but we're going to have to cut it after that.
I don't know if I deserve it, Bob, but Steve Bassett, Paradigm Research Group. The officers from the key early incidents obviously are in their 80s, early to mid 80s, and many of them have passed. Now the security personnel, topside, the younger fellows are now in their early 70s. Many of them actually saw the craft. Are you aware of any of these security fellows that were up top that are prepared and willing to come and testify before Congress?
Okay, Mr.
I'm not aware if they're prepared to testify before Congress, but I've talked to a couple of security guards in person, and they're very intimidated to come out and speak, especially one of them that I understand works for the State Department, and you can understand the considerations he has to make.
Okay, I'm afraid we're going to have to terminate it. We're out of time here. So thank you again for coming. Thank you.